Most people don't wake up wanting to do nothing. They wake up wanting meaning, momentum, progress, yet somewhere between intention and action, the system shuts down. Not because you're weak, not because you lack discipline, but because your brain has been pushed beyond its adaptive limits. We now live in an environment of constant stimulation, endless novelty, frictionless pleasure, perpetual alerts, and the nervous system was never designed for this load. When stimulation is everywhere, motivation collapses, effort feels heavier, focus feels unreachable. Today, we're going to unpack a simple but uncomfortable truth. You're not lazy. Your brain is overstimulated, and it's responding exactly as biology predicts. To understand why motivation feels so hard today, we have to start with a fundamental principle of neuroscience. Brain is a prediction machine. It is constantly adjusting its internal baseline based on the environment it's exposed to. When stimulation is rare, the brain becomes sensitive. When stimulation is constant, the brain becomes numb. This process is not a flaw. It's adaptation. In a low-stimulation environment, small rewards generate a meaningful signal. Completing a task, making progress, or even anticipating effort produces enough dopamine to drive action. But when the brain is flooded with high-intensity stimuli, social media, fast entertainment, endless scrolling, hyper-palatable content, the baseline shifts upward. What once felt motivating now feels flat. This is known as hedonic adaptation, and it operates automatically. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the molecule of pleasure. In reality, dopamine is about motivation, pursuit, and effort allocation. It tells the brain what is worth working for. When dopamine levels spike repeatedly without effort, through constant stimulation, the brain recalibrates. Baseline dopamine drops. As a result, activities that require sustained effort feel disproportionately difficult. Not because they are harder, but because the internal signal that says this is worth doing has been weakened. This is why people often report feeling unmotivated, foggy, or emotionally flat despite having access to more entertainment and convenience than ever before. The nervous system interprets constant stimulation as a signal that resources are abundant and effort is unnecessary. In evolutionary terms, if food, novelty, and reward are everywhere, there is no need to mobilize energy. Motivation shuts down as a conservation strategy. Another critical piece here is contrast. The brain does not measure reward in absolute terms. It measures change relative to baseline. When your baseline is elevated by constant stimulation, normal life activities fall below that threshold. Reading, studying, working, exercising, these are no longer competing with zero stimulation. They're competing with highly optimized reward systems designed to hijack attention. The result is a chronic mismatch between effort and perceived payoff. Over time, this elevated baseline doesn't just reduce motivation, it alters identity. People begin to label themselves as lazy, undisciplined, or broken, but biologically, the system is functioning exactly as designed. The brain is protecting itself from overload by dampening drive. This is similar to how loud environments make the auditory system less sensitive. Continuous exposure leads to reduced responsiveness. Importantly, this process is reversible. Baselines are not fixed. Neuroplasticity works in both directions. When stimulation is reduced intentionally and consistently, the brain recalibrates downward. Dopamine signaling becomes more tightly linked to effort. Motivation returns not as a surge of excitement, but as a quiet willingness to engage. Tasks feel lighter. Focus becomes accessible again. This is why periods of boredom, stillness, and low stimulation are not signs of weakness, but essential tools for recovery. They allow the nervous system to reset its reference point. In that lower baseline state, progress itself becomes rewarding again. Effort regains meaning. So when motivation feels absent, the question is not what's wrong with me. The better question is what has my brain adapted to? Because once you understand that overstimulation raises the baseline and suppresses drive, the path forward becomes clear. You don't need more hacks, more pressure, or more self-criticism. You need less noise so your biology can do what it's always done best: recalibrate, recover, and re-engage. Effort is not inherently painful. In fact, under the right neurochemical conditions, effort is deeply satisfying. The problem is not work itself, it's the state of the dopamine system that evaluates whether work is worth the cost. When dopamine signaling is dysregulated by overload, the brain assigns an exaggerated pain tag to effort. The task hasn't changed, the biology has. Dopamine operates on a balance system. Peaks above baseline are followed by drops below baseline. This is not optional. It is how neurons maintain stability. When someone repeatedly exposes themselves to high dopamine activities, rapid content, instant rewards, constant novelty, the peaks become frequent and intense. Over time, the brain compensates by lowering baseline dopamine. This creates a subtle but powerful shift in perception. Effort now feels heavier than it actually is. In this low baseline state, the brain interprets effort as a threat to energy reserves, initiating action triggers discomfort, resistance, and avoidance. This is why people often describe a physical sensation of friction when trying to start important tasks. It's not a lack of willpower, it's the nervous system signaling this cost is too high for the expected reward. Another critical mechanism here is anticipation. Dopamine is released not when you receive a reward, but when you anticipate one. When the brain is trained on instant gratification, anticipation collapses. There is no buildup, no tension, no forward pull. Tasks that require delayed payoff learning, building, training fail to generate sufficient anticipatory dopamine. As a result, the motivational engine never turns over. This explains why scrolling feels effortless while focused work feels exhausting, even when the work is meaningful. The scrolling delivers immediate dopamine without cost. The work demands energy before reward. In a dopamine-depleted baseline, the brain chooses the path of least resistance. This is not a moral failure. It's a predictable outcome of reinforcement learning. Over time, this imbalance creates a dangerous feedback loop. Because effort feels painful, people avoid it. Avoidance reduces opportunities for natural dopamine release tied to progress. This further lowers baseline levels, making future effort feel even worse. Eventually, the individual begins to associate effort itself with stress and failure rather than growth and reward. Importantly, the pain of effort in this state is not imaginary. Neuroimaging studies show increased activity in brain regions associated with aversion when low dopamine individuals attempt sustained tasks. The brain is quite literally oversignaling cost. This is why simply pushing harder often backfires. Forcing effort without restoring dopamine balance increases burnout and deepens avoidance. The solution is not eliminating effort, but reconditioning the dopamine system. This begins by reducing high-intensity, low-effort rewards. When dopamine spikes become less frequent, baseline begins to recover. As baseline rises, the perceived pain of effort decreases. Tasks don't become exciting, but they become tolerable. And tolerable is enough to start. Another powerful shift occurs when effort itself becomes the reward. When dopamine release is linked to the act of engaging, not the outcome, the brain learns a new association. This is why protocols that emphasize process over results are so effective. They retrain the nervous system to find meaning in exertion. Ultimately, dopamine overload doesn't remove your ability to work. It distorts your perception of cost. Once that distortion is corrected, effort stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like progress again. Motivation doesn't return as hype or intensity. It returns as clarity, steadiness, and the quiet confidence that effort is no longer something to fear. The human brain evolved to notice change. Novelty signals opportunity, threat, and learning. In small doses, it sharpens attention and accelerates adaptation. But when novelty becomes constant, when the brain is exposed to an endless stream of new information, images, ideas, and stimuli, the very system designed to enhance focus begins to undermine it. At the neural level, novelty strongly activates dopamine pathways. Each new stimulus creates a small prediction error. Something unexpected has occurred. The brain responds by releasing dopamine to encourage exploration. This is useful when novelty is rare. But in a modern environment, novelty is no longer a signal. It's the background. The brain is pushed into a perpetual exploratory mode. Exploration and focus are opposing states. Exploration is broad, shallow, and fast. Focus is narrow, deep, and slow. When the brain is constantly rewarded for switching, scanning, and sampling, it becomes inefficient at staying. The neural circuits responsible for sustained attention, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, are underused. Like any biological system, circuits that are not engaged begin to weaken. This is why many people report that they can consume hours of content but struggle to read a few pages, think deeply, or stay with a single task. The brain has been trained through reinforcement to seek the next stimulus rather than extract value from the current one. Attention becomes fragmented not because of distraction, but because fragmentation has become the default strategy. Importantly, this is not about intelligence or discipline, it's about conditioning. Each time you switch tasks, check a notification, or chase a new idea, the brain receives a dopamine signal. Over time, staying with one thing produces less reward than leaving it. Sustained focus begins to feel uncomfortable, even threatening, because it deprives the brain of the novelty it has learned to expect. There is also a metabolic cost to novelty. Constant switching increases cognitive load and mental fatigue. The brain burns more energy evaluating new inputs than it does refining existing ones. This leads to a state where the mind feels busy but unproductive, active without progress. Many people mistake this for motivation, when in reality it's overstimulation. Another critical consequence is the erosion of depth. Learning, creativity, and insight require time within a problem. When novelty interrupts that process, ideas remain shallow. The brain never reaches the slower neural rhythms associated with deep understanding. Over time, this creates frustration. People feel capable, yet unable to produce meaningful output. The good news is that focus is trainable. The same neuroplastic mechanisms that weakened sustained attention can rebuild it. But the process requires deliberate resistance to novelty. This means creating environments where there is nothing new to escape to. Boredom, in this context, is not a failure state. It is the gateway to depth. When novelty is reduced, the brain initially rebels. Restlessness increases, urges to switch intensify. This is a withdrawal-like response from a system accustomed to constant stimulation. But if maintained, the nervous system adapts. Dopamine release begins to associate with staying rather than switching. Focus becomes rewarding again. Over time, sustained attention no longer feels like force. It feels like immersion. The brain regains its ability to hold a single thread of thought, to explore ideas fully, and to produce work that reflects depth rather than speed. Constant novelty trained the brain to leave. Reducing novelty trains it to stay, and staying is where real progress happens. The brain learns through association. When effort reliably leads to reward, motivation is strengthened. When reward arrives without effort, that link begins to dissolve. This is one of the most profound effects of digital environments. They deliver reward without requiring meaningful exertion, and over time, they retrain the brain to expect satisfaction without work. In natural settings, dopamine release is closely tied to effort and progression. Hunting, learning, building, training all require energy before payoff. The dopamine system evolved to reinforce this sequence, but digital rewards bypass it. Likes, notifications, short-form content, and instant entertainment provide rapid dopamine spikes with minimal cost. The brain registers reward, but it does not register effort. This mismatch creates a learning error. The nervous system begins to predict reward without action. When later confronted with tasks that require sustained effort, the expected dopamine release is missing. Satisfaction feels delayed, uncertain, or absent. As a result, effort feels unrewarding not because the task lacks value, but because the brain's reward prediction has been distorted. Over time, this alters motivation at a structural level. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway becomes more responsive to passive consumption and less responsive to active engagement. People begin to feel energized while consuming but depleted when producing. This is not a personality flaw. It's a consequence of repeated reinforcement. Another critical factor is timing. Digital rewards are immediate. Effort-based rewards are delayed. The dopamine system is highly sensitive to temporal gaps. When rewards arrive too quickly, the brain discounts delayed outcomes. This is why long-term goals, fitness, mastery, meaningful work, lose their pull in high-stimulation environments. The brain has been trained to prefer now over later. This also explains the growing sense of emptiness many people feel after extended digital consumption. Dopamine spikes without effort are followed by sharp drops below baseline. Satisfaction is brief, and the come-down is noticeable. Without the stabilizing effect of effort, linked reward, pleasure becomes volatile. You feel good, then flat. Engaged, then drained. Importantly, effort is not just a cost. It amplifies reward. When dopamine release follows exertion, the signal is stronger and longer lasting. Satisfaction deepens because the brain associates it with agency and progress. Digital rewards lack this amplification. They stimulate, but they do not fulfill. As this pattern repeats, the brain begins to avoid effort altogether. Why work when reward is available instantly? This is not laziness, it's efficiency as far as the nervous system is concerned. But efficiency in the short term becomes dysfunction in the long term. The skills required for persistence, resilience, and pride in achievement begin to erode. Rebuilding the effort-satisfaction link requires intentional friction. This means reducing low-effort rewards and reintroducing challenges that demand engagement. The brain must relearn that effort predicts satisfaction. Initially, this feels uncomfortable. The dopamine system resists the change. But with repetition, the association strengthens. Over time, something remarkable happens. Satisfaction becomes quieter but more stable. Progress itself becomes rewarding. You no longer need constant stimulation to feel engaged. Digital rewards lose their grip because they cannot compete with the depth of effort-based fulfillment. When effort and satisfaction are reunited, motivation becomes self-sustaining. Not driven by pressure or hype, but by a restored biological truth. What you work for is what feels worth having. Rest is not simply the absence of work. True rest is a specific biological state in which the nervous system downshifts, repairs, and recalibrates. In a hyper-stimulated environment, that state has become increasingly rare. Many people believe they are resting, but neurologically they are not. The brain is still working, just on different inputs. When the nervous system is exposed to constant stimulation, it remains in a semi-activated state. Scrolling, streaming, and rapid content consumption feel passive, but they keep the brain alert, evaluative, and responsive. visual processing, decision making, and reward circuits stay engaged. As a result, the system never fully transitions into recovery mode. From a neurochemical perspective, restorative rest requires low dopamine, low norepinephrine, and increased parasympathetic activity. This is the state associated with calm, digestion, and repair. But digital stimulation repeatedly spikes dopamine and norepinephrine even when the body is physically still. The brain interprets this as wakefulness with demand, not rest. This is why people often feel tired despite spending hours relaxing. Mental fatigue accumulates because the brain never disengages. Sleep quality suffers as well. When stimulation continues late into the evening, circadian rhythms are disrupted and melatonin release is delayed. The brain enters sleep with elevated arousal, reducing depth and efficiency of recovery. Another important factor is sensory load. True rest involves reduced sensory input. Modern environments rarely provide this. Even quiet moments are filled with background noise, artificial light, or micro-decisions. The nervous system remains vigilant. Over time, this leads to a chronic stress signature, subtle, persistent, and exhausting. In this state, motivation declines further. Rest is supposed to restore drive by replenishing neurochemical resources. When rest fails to do this, each day begins with a deficit. Effort feels heavier not because tasks are harder, but because recovery was incomplete. The system is running on empty. There is also a psychological cost. When rest doesn't work, people begin to feel broken. They sleep, they take breaks, yet nothing improves. This creates frustration and self-blame, but the issue is not insufficient rest. It's ineffective rest. Restorative rest requires intentional reduction of stimulation. This includes periods of stillness, low light, minimal input, and absence of novelty. Activities like walking without headphones, sitting quietly, or engaging in slow, repetitive tasks allow the nervous system to shift states. Initially, this can feel uncomfortable. The brain, accustomed to stimulation, resists quiet, but that discomfort is a sign of recalibration beginning. Over time, these low stimulation states restore sensitivity. Dopamine baselines normalize, norepinephrine regulation improves. Sleep deepens, energy returns not as excitement, but as capacity. You wake up with more available effort because the system has actually recovered. Importantly, rest is not a luxury, it's a requirement for motivation. Without it, no amount of discipline can compensate. The brain cannot produce sustained drive without periodic downshifting. In a hyper-stimulated world, rest must be protected and redesigned, not as entertainment, but as true nervous system recovery. When rest becomes restorative again, motivation stops feeling forced and starts feeling natural. Motivation is not something you summon through force or positive thinking. It is an emergent property of a well-regulated nervous system. When stimulation is excessive, motivation disappears not because you lack drive, but because the brain has adapted to an environment that requires none. When stimulation is deliberately reduced, the system recalibrates and motivation returns as a biological consequence. The dopamine system is central here. Dopamine does not respond well to chaos, it responds to contrast. When stimulation is constant, contrast disappears, everything blends into noise. By reducing stimulation, you restore contrast. Small wins matter again. Effort produces a detectable signal. The brain relearns what is worth pursuing. This reduction does not require extreme deprivation. It requires intentional boundaries, fewer dopamine spikes. Longer gaps between rewards, less novelty layered onto every moment. These changes allow baseline dopamine to rise. As baseline rises, the cost of effort decreases. Tasks feel more approachable, not because they are easier, but because the internal resistance has been lowered. One of the most important shifts that occurs during stimulation reduction is the return of anticipatory dopamine. When rewards are delayed, the brain begins to generate motivation in advance of action. You feel a pull toward the task rather than a push away from it. This is the mechanism behind sustainable drive. Motivation becomes proactive instead of reactive. There is often a withdrawal phase. When stimulation drops, boredom, restlessness, and irritability increase. This is not a failure. It is evidence of neural recalibration. The brain is adjusting its expectations. If stimulation is reintroduced during this phase, the reset is interrupted. If the reduction is maintained, the discomfort passes. As recalibration continues, effort becomes intrinsically rewarding. Dopamine release shifts from outcomes to process. You begin to feel satisfaction from showing up, from engaging, from making incremental progress. This is the state in which discipline feels light. Action no longer requires constant self-negotiation. Another critical effect is clarity. With less input, the prefrontal cortex regains control. Decision fatigue decreases. Priorities sharpen. The mind becomes quieter, not empty, but ordered. This cognitive clarity further reinforces motivation because the brain is no longer overwhelmed by competing signals. Importantly, this approach restores agency. Instead of being pulled by external stimuli, behavior becomes internally guided. The brain moves from consumption mode to creation mode. This shift is deeply stabilizing. It rebuilds confidence not through achievement, but through control of attention. Motivation returning does not feel like a surge of excitement. It feels like readiness, a calm willingness to do what needs to be done. A sense that effort is no longer threatening. This is the natural state of a nervous system operating within its adaptive limits. So if motivation feels gone, the solution is not more stimulation, more pressure, or more self-criticism. It is less noise, less novelty, less artificial reward. In that space, the brain does what it has always done when conditions are right. It generates drive.